My dad's brother ghosted us for 10 years after dad stopped giving him money, but 3 weeks after my dad's funeral he emailed wanting to reconnect and help with our business. Then he tried to marry my mom to get legal access, so we got a restraining order. I, 28M, run my family's construction company. My dad, 56M when he passed, died 6 months ago from a heart attack. He was at the office going over blueprints when it happened. 1 minute he was talking to the site manager about the Johnson project, the next minute he was on the floor. The paramedics said he was gone before they got there. My mom, 54F, and I have been living in the same house where I grew up. It's a large property on Oakwood Drive that my dad bought 20 years ago when the business started doing well. The house has 4 bedrooms, a study that still has all of dad's books and files, and a backyard with a workshop my dad used on weekends. I haven't moved anything from his study. His reading glasses are still on the desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Dad spent 15 years building King Construction from nothing. He started with 1 truck and 2 employees. By the time he died, we had 40 employees and contracts worth millions. Dad trained me since I was 16. I spent summers working on sites, learning how to read blueprints, understanding material costs, dealing with contractors and suppliers. After college, I joined the company full-time. Dad made me project manager at 24. He taught me everything about running the business. The company is legally mine now. Dad updated his will 2 years ago. Everything was documented properly with his lawyer. There was no confusion about who would inherit what. Mom got the house and some investments. I got the business because I had been working in it for years. Dad had 3 brothers. His family wasn't wealthy when he was growing up. They lived in a small apartment downtown. Dad was the youngest. His oldest brother Vince spent years asking Dad for money. Vince would show up at family gatherings asking for loans that were never repaid. He borrowed money for a car, for his rent, for his kids' school fees. Dad gave him money for years until he married Mom. Mom told Dad that Vince was taking advantage of him. She showed Dad bank statements proving that Vince had borrowed over $50,000 across 8 years and never paid back a cent. Dad finally said no. Vince got angry. He stopped coming to family events. He told other relatives that Dad had become selfish and money-obsessed after marriage. 2 of Dad's cousins sided with Vince. They stopped talking to Dad too. Dad's funeral had maybe 30 people. Most were business associates and employees. Only 1 of Dad's brothers showed up. Vince didn't come. 2 aunts attended but left right after the service. Mom handled all the funeral arrangements because I was barely functional that week. I remember sitting in the front row at the church and noticing how empty the family section was. The business didn't stop when Dad died. Projects had deadlines. Clients needed updates. Employees had questions. I went back to work after a week because there was no choice. The Johnson project needed someone to sign off on the foundation work. The Martinez contract required a meeting about cost overruns. I sat in Dad's office chair and went through his files trying to figure out what needed immediate attention. 3 weeks after the funeral, I got an email. The sender was Vince King. I hadn't heard from him in over 10 years. The subject line said long overdue conversation. The email was 6 paragraphs long. Vince wrote that he felt terrible about missing the funeral. He said he was traveling for work and only heard about Dad's death a week later. He claimed he wanted to reconnect and make up for lost time. He mentioned he would be in town for a business conference and wanted to meet for dinner. I showed the email to Mom. She read it twice and then put her phone down. She said we should meet him once and be civil. She didn't want to carry grudges. She thought maybe Vince had changed. I wasn't convinced, but I agreed to one dinner. We met at a steakhouse near downtown. Vince showed up 15 minutes late. He's 61 now. He had gained weight and his hair was completely gray. He wore an expensive-looking suit, but it didn't fit him properly. He hugged Mom for too long. He shook my hand and held it with both hands while staring at my face. He said I looked exactly like Dad at my age. He said it 4 times during the first 10 minutes. Vince ordered the most expensive steak on the menu. He ordered wine and dessert. He talked about his consulting business. He said he advises small companies on financial management. He didn't mention what companies or provide specifics. He asked Mom how she was managing. He asked me about the business in a way that felt like he was testing me. He wanted to know how many active projects we had. He asked about annual revenue. He asked if I had hired a financial advisor. Mom told him the business was doing fine. She said I had been working with Dad for years and knew what I was doing. Vince nodded, but he had this expression like he didn't believe it. He said running a business after losing a parent was incredibly difficult. He said most people in my position would sell and take the money rather than deal with the pressure. He said there was no shame in admitting you need help. I told him I wasn't selling. I told him Dad built this company for me to run. Vince smiled and said that was admirable but naive. He said the construction industry was brutal and unforgiving. He said one bad quarter could sink everything. He offered to look over our books and provide guidance. He said he had 30 years of business experience and could spot problems I might miss. Mom changed the subject. She asked Vince about his family. He said he never married and had no kids. He said he regretted not settling down. He said family was the most important thing and he wasted years chasing money instead of relationships. He looked at me when he said this. He said he wished he could have been there for me growing up. He said he wanted to be a proper uncle now, even though it was late. The dinner lasted 2 hours. Vince paid the bill. He hugged Mom again when we left. He said he would stay in town for another week and wanted to visit our home. Mom said okay before I could object. Vince showed up at our house 3 days later. He brought flowers for Mom and a bottle of whiskey for me. He walked around the house commenting on everything. He went into Dad's study without asking. He picked up the books on the shelf and flipped through Dad's notebooks. He asked if I was going through Dad's files to learn his methods. He said it was important to understand how Dad made decisions. He came back 4 more times that week. Each visit lasted longer. He started asking specific questions about the company. He wanted to know who our biggest clients were. He asked about profit margins on recent projects. He asked if we had debt. He asked if I had reviewed the employee contracts. He asked if our insurance policies were current. I started avoiding his questions. I gave vague answers. Mom noticed I was getting tense during his visits. She suggested we tell him to give us space. Before we could say anything, Vince showed up with printed documents. He said he had done research on construction companies in our region. He had data on bankruptcy rates and acquisition trends. He spread the papers on our kitchen table and went through them point by point. He said companies like ours were vulnerable without experienced leadership. He said I was too young to handle the complexities alone. He said I needed a partner or advisor with real business expertise. I told him I appreciated his concern but I had things under control. He laughed. He said young people always think they have things under control until they don't. He said pride was dangerous in business. He asked if I had considered bringing him on as a consultant. He said he could review our operations and identify inefficiencies. He said he would do it for family rates. Mom asked what family rates meant. Vince said he would work for equity instead of cash payments. He wanted 10% of the company in exchange for his consulting services. He said it was a bargain compared to what professional consultants charged. I told him no. I told him the company wasn't looking for consultants or partners. Vince's expression changed. The friendly uncle act disappeared. He said I was making a mistake. He said Dad would have wanted family involved in the business. He said I was dishonoring Dad's memory by shutting out his brother. Mom told him to leave. Vince stood up slowly. He said he was trying to help. He said we would regret refusing his offer. He left without saying goodbye. I thought that was the end of it. I blocked his number. Mom blocked him too. I told the office receptionist not to let him in if he showed up. I focused on work. The Johnson project finished on schedule. We landed a new contract for an office building renovation. The business was stable. Vince sent emails. I deleted them without reading. He sent a letter to our house. Mom threw it away. He called the office from different numbers. The receptionist told him I was unavailable every time. Then Vince showed up at our house unannounced. Mom was home alone. She didn't answer the door. Vince stood outside ringing the doorbell for 20 minutes. Our neighbor called Mom to ask if everything was okay because a man was yelling on our porch. Mom called me. I left work and drove home. Vince was gone by the time I arrived. I filed a police report for harassment. The officer said unless Vince made specific threats, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested we get a restraining order if the behavior continued. The officer took Vince's information and said they would contact him to warn him about trespassing. Vince didn't show up again for 2 weeks. I thought maybe the police warning worked. Then Mom got a friend request on social media from an account that looked like Vince using a fake name. The account had no profile picture and no other friends. Mom blocked it. I posted on Reddit asking if I was wrong for refusing to let my uncle help with the family business. I explained the history of Vince asking Dad for money. I explained how he disappeared when Dad stopped giving him loans. I explained how he suddenly appeared after Dad died. People responded saying Vince was obviously after money. Several people said to cut all contact. Someone suggested getting cameras installed at the house. We installed security cameras. We got ones that covered the front door, back door, and driveway. We also got doorbell cameras. I showed Mom how to check the footage on her phone. Update 1: Vince came back. He showed up at the house again last Tuesday. This time he didn't ring the doorbell. He just stood in the driveway staring at the cameras. He stood there for 15 minutes. Then he left. Mom called me. I checked the camera footage. Vince's face was clearly visible. He looked directly at the camera multiple times. It seemed like he wanted us to know he was there. I called the non-emergency police line. They sent an officer to take a report. The officer said the behavior was concerning but still not enough for an arrest. He said Vince wasn't technically trespassing since he stayed in the driveway. The officer suggested we pursue a restraining order through the courts. I contacted a lawyer. The lawyer said we had enough evidence to file for a restraining order. We submitted the paperwork along with the camera footage, the police reports, and documentation of the deleted emails and blocked calls. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Vince escalated. He started showing up at the office. Our receptionist called building security. Vince argued with the security guard saying he had a right to visit his nephew's workplace. Security escorted him out. He came back the next day. Security called the police. Vince left before they arrived. He also started contacting our clients. One of our biggest clients called me asking why my dad's brother was reaching out about the company. The client said Vince sent an email claiming there were problems with the business and offering his consulting services. I had to explain the situation. The client was understanding, but I could tell it made them uncomfortable. 2 more clients received similar emails from Vince. I sent a mass email to all our clients explaining that Vince King was not affiliated with the company and any communication from him should be ignored. I had to CC our lawyer on the email in case Vince tried to sue for defamation. The restraining order hearing finally happened. Vince showed up with his own lawyer. His lawyer argued that Vince was simply trying to help family and that we were overreacting. Our lawyer presented the camera footage, the police reports, the emails to our clients, and testimony from our office receptionist about his repeated attempts to enter the building. The judge granted a temporary restraining order. Vince was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from our home, our office, and both Mom and me personally. The order was valid for 6 months with a possibility of extension. Vince stared at me as we left the courtroom. His lawyer had to physically turn him around and guide him out a different door. I thought the restraining order would end it. Instead, things got worse in a different way. 4 days after the hearing, Mom got a call from Vince's lawyer. The lawyer said Vince wanted to schedule a family meeting to discuss a business proposition. I told Mom to hang up. She did. 2 days later, we got a formal letter delivered to our house by courier. The letter was from Vince's lawyer. It contained a proposal. Vince wanted to marry my mom. The letter actually used those words. It said Vince had always admired my mom and felt that combining their lives would honor Dad's memory. It said Vince wanted to adopt me as his legal son even though I'm 28. It said this would officially make Vince part of the family business and give him the authority to help manage company operations. The letter was 3 pages long. It outlined how the arrangement would work. Vince would move into our house. He would take over financial decisions for the household and the business. The letter said Mom would benefit from having a companion and I would benefit from having a father figure and business mentor. The final paragraph said we had 1 week to consider the proposal. It said if we agreed, Vince's lawyer would draw up the necessary marriage and adoption papers. It said this was a generous offer that would solve everyone's problems. Mom read the letter 3 times. Then she put it on the kitchen table and walked out of the room. I heard her bedroom door close. She stayed in her room for 2 hours. I scanned the letter and emailed it to our lawyer. He called me back within an hour. He said it was the most bizarre thing he had seen in 20 years of practice. He said the proposal had no legal weight and we should ignore it. He said we could potentially add it to our restraining order case as evidence of harassment. Mom came back downstairs. She picked up the letter and tore it into pieces. She put the pieces in the garbage disposal and turned it on. She didn't say anything about it. 3 days later, Vince violated the restraining order. He came to our house. He rang the doorbell. Mom and I were both home. We didn't answer. He rang the doorbell 15 times. Then he started knocking. He yelled through the door that he just wanted to talk. He said we were being unreasonable. He said his proposal was for everyone's benefit. I called the police while Mom recorded video on her phone from the window. The police arrived in 8 minutes. They arrested Vince for violating the restraining order. He spent the night in jail. Update 2: Vince got out of jail after 1 night. He had to appear in court for violating the restraining order. The judge extended the restraining order to 1 year and added a clause that any further violations would result in immediate jail time of at least 30 days. We thought that would be enough. It wasn't. Vince started contacting Dad's relatives. He called Dad's cousins and the few family members who still maintained some contact with us. He told them that I had manipulated Dad into leaving me the business. He said Dad wasn't mentally competent when he updated his will. He claimed I had isolated Dad from his family and poisoned him against Vince. One of Dad's cousins called Mom to ask if this was true. Mom explained the real history. She told them about all the money Vince borrowed and never repaid. She explained that Dad cut off Vince years before he got sick. The cousin apologized and said she wouldn't talk to Vince again. But 2 other relatives believed Vince. They started calling us too. They said they wanted their fair share of Dad's estate. One of them claimed Dad had promised to help pay for his daughter's college. Another said Dad owed him money from 20 years ago. Neither of them had documentation. Neither of them had attended Dad's funeral or contacted us in the 6 months since he died. Our lawyer advised us to block them and keep records of all communication. He said they had no legal standing but they might cause trouble anyway. Then we got sued. Vince filed a lawsuit claiming he was entitled to a portion of the company. His legal argument was that Dad was mentally incompetent when he updated his will 2 years ago. Vince claimed Dad was suffering from depression and anxiety that affected his judgment. Vince said I had taken advantage of Dad's mental state to get him to sign over the business. The lawsuit named me, Mom, and Dad's estate lawyer as defendants. It demanded that the will be declared invalid and that Dad's assets be distributed according to state intestacy laws, which would give Vince a share as Dad's brother. The lawsuit was 30 pages long. It included testimony from one of Dad's cousins who claimed Dad seemed forgetful and confused at a family gathering 4 years ago. It included medical records that Vince had somehow obtained showing Dad was prescribed medication for high blood pressure and cholesterol. Vince's lawyer argued that these medications could cause cognitive impairment. Our lawyer said the lawsuit was frivolous, but we still had to respond. We had to hire additional legal help. The costs started adding up. We had to provide documentation proving Dad was mentally competent. We had to get testimony from Dad's doctor, from his business associates, from employees who worked with him daily. Dad's estate lawyer testified that Dad was completely lucid when he updated his will. He said Dad specifically discussed his reasons for leaving the business to me. He said Dad talked about how I had worked in the company for years and understood all aspects of the operations. He said Dad expressed concern that his brothers would try to claim the business after his death and he wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity. We found Dad's training logs. Dad had kept detailed records of everything he taught me. He had notebooks going back 10 years with notes about projects I worked on, skills I learned, mistakes I made and how I corrected them. Every notebook was dated and organized. They clearly showed Dad's mental capacity and his long-term planning. The discovery phase took 4 months. Vince's lawyer requested hundreds of documents. They wanted bank statements, business records, medical files, emails, text messages. Our lawyer objected to most of the requests as overly broad and irrelevant. The judge agreed with us on most items, but we still had to produce a lot of paperwork. During this time, the business suffered. I was spending hours each week dealing with the lawsuit instead of focusing on projects. 2 potential clients chose other contractors because they heard about the legal dispute and didn't want to work with a company involved in litigation. Our insurance premiums went up because the lawsuit created additional risk exposure. Mom stopped sleeping well. She was up at night worrying about legal costs. We had already spent $30,000 on lawyer fees. Our lawyer estimated the case could cost another $50,000 if it went to trial. I filed a countersuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Our lawyer said Vince's false claims about Dad's mental competence and my manipulation were clearly defamatory. We documented every false statement Vince made to relatives and clients. We showed how his actions damaged the company's reputation and caused us emotional harm. The depositions were scheduled. I had to sit in a conference room while Vince's lawyer asked me questions for 6 hours. He asked about my relationship with Dad, about every conversation I could remember, about the day Dad updated his will, about company finances, about my qualifications to run the business. I answered every question honestly. Our lawyer objected to questions that were irrelevant or harassing. Mom's deposition lasted 4 hours. They asked her about Dad's mental state, about his moods, about his daily routines, about arguments we had, about family dynamics. Mom stayed calm and factual throughout. Dad's doctor gave a deposition. He testified that Dad had no cognitive issues. He said Dad's blood pressure and cholesterol medications had no side effects that would impair mental function. He said he saw Dad for regular checkups and Dad was always sharp and engaged. Update 3: The trial lasted 3 days. Vince showed up every day wearing the same ill-fitting suit from our first dinner. He sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer and took notes constantly. Vince's lawyer presented their case first. He called the cousin who claimed Dad seemed confused at a family gathering. The cousin testified that Dad forgot his name once and mixed up dates when talking about past events. On cross-examination, our lawyer established that this gathering was 4 years ago, that the cousin admitted Dad had been drinking alcohol that day, and that the cousin hadn't seen Dad in person in over 3 years. Vince's lawyer tried to introduce Dad's medical records as evidence of cognitive decline. Our lawyer objected. The judge reviewed the records and ruled they showed normal age-related health concerns with no indication of mental impairment. Vince testified. He claimed Dad called him 2 months before he died asking for help with the business. He said Dad admitted he made a mistake leaving everything to me. He said Dad wanted to change the will but died before he could. When our lawyer cross-examined him, Vince couldn't provide any proof of this alleged phone call. He couldn't explain why he didn't attend Dad's funeral if they had recently reconciled. He couldn't explain why he waited 3 weeks after the funeral to contact us. His testimony fell apart. Our lawyer presented Dad's training logs. The judge spent an hour reviewing them. She commented that they showed extraordinary detail and clear thinking. She said anyone reading these logs could see Dad had full mental capacity and specific intentions for the business. Dad's estate lawyer testified again. He brought his own notes from the will update meeting. The notes showed Dad specifically instructed him to include language preventing Vince from challenging the will. Dad had predicted exactly what was happening now. We presented evidence of Vince's harassment. The camera footage, the police reports, the bizarre marriage proposal letter, the violation of the restraining order. We showed the emails Vince sent to our clients. We documented every false statement he made about Dad and about me. The judge took 2 days to review everything. When we came back for the verdict, she spent 15 minutes explaining her reasoning. She said Vince's case had no merit. She said the evidence clearly showed Dad was mentally competent and made informed decisions about his estate. She said Vince's behavior after Dad's death was appalling and transparent in its motivations. She dismissed Vince's lawsuit entirely. Then she ruled on our countersuit. She found Vince liable for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She awarded us $90,000 in damages. She also ordered Vince to pay our legal costs, which totaled $87,000. Vince stood up and started yelling. His lawyer tried to calm him down. Security had to escort him from the courtroom. As he was being let out, he shouted that we would pay for this and that Dad would be ashamed of me. The judgment was final. Vince had 30 days to pay. He didn't. Our lawyer began garnishment proceedings. Vince declared bankruptcy. We got some of the money from the sale of his car and some belongings, but not the full amount. Our lawyer said we might never collect everything, but the judgment itself was worth more than the money because it was public record proving Vince's actions and our innocence. Vince left town. We heard from one of the cousins that he moved to another state. He stopped contacting us. The restraining order is still active for 6 more months, but we haven't needed it. The company recovered. The 2 clients who left came back after the trial results were published. We landed 3 major contracts this year. I hired 2 new project managers and expanded our operations. Mom sold the house on Oakwood Drive. She said it had too many memories and she wanted a fresh start. She bought a smaller place across town with better security. I helped her move. We didn't take anything from Dad's study except his training logs and a few personal items. Everything else was donated or sold. I still run the business from the same office where Dad worked. His name is still on the building. Employees who worked with him still tell me stories about projects they did together. I keep his training logs in my office. Sometimes I read through them when I need to make difficult decisions. The relatives who sided with Vince stopped contacting us after the trial. The ones who stayed neutral reached out to apologize. We accepted their apologies, but we don't attend family events anymore. Mom and I have holidays alone or with friends from work. People ask if I regret meeting Vince for that first dinner. I don't know. Maybe if we had ignored his email, he would have found another way to cause problems. At least this way everything is resolved legally and permanently. The business is mine. The house is secure. Vince is gone. That's where things stand now. Now let's move to the next story. Story 2. My dad abandoned me during my brother's cancer treatment. Years later he wants to reconnect, so I sent him a PowerPoint of his failures. When my aunt called it unnecessarily cruel, I told her my mother made me scrapbooks while dying, but he couldn't even text on my birthday. I, 23F, recently did something that my relatives are calling unnecessarily cruel, but I honestly don't know if I should feel bad about it. I've been no contact with my father for 5 years now, and there's a reason for that. But I need outside perspective on whether I went too far. When I was 6, my father Lucas and my mother Elise were a normal couple with a young daughter, me, Sarah. My mother worked as a librarian and spent her free time making scrapbooks. She documented everything. Our family trips, my first day of school, holidays. Each scrapbook page had little notes and quotes that captured the moment. I still remember watching her carefully arrange photos and write little messages in her perfect handwriting. Everything changed when my mother was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. The prognosis wasn't good from the start. The doctors tried everything, but the cancer spread rapidly. She spent most of her final months in the hospital. During that time, even with all the pain medication and treatments, she continued making scrapbook pages for me. Not full books anymore, just single pages with photos, small drawings, and notes. My aunt would bring her supplies, and she'd work on them when she had enough energy. My mother died when I was 8. At the funeral, my aunt handed me a binder with all the scrapbook pages my mother had made during her hospital stay. There were 27 pages total. The last one had a picture of our family vacation to a lake a year before she got sick. We were all smiling. My mother had written, "Sarah, Dad and I will always be here for you, even when you can't see me. Love spans distances." After my mother died, I started carrying a small notebook everywhere. A school counselor suggested it might help me process my feelings. I filled the pages with little drawings, collected things like ticket stubs or leaves, and wrote about my day, basically copying my mother's scrapbooking style, but in notebook form. It became a habit, and I've maintained it for 15 years now. I have a box with 32 full notebooks at my apartment. My father tried his best for a while. He worked full-time as an accountant, and my maternal grandparents helped with childcare. Then, when I was 10, he met Evelyn. They dated for about 6 months before getting married. On the day they told me they were getting married, Evelyn said, "Now I'll be your mom, and we'll be a real family again." My father nodded along, smiling. I wrote in my notebook that night, "Evelyn says she's my mom now." Dad seems happy about this. Mom made me 27 pages from her hospital bed. No one can replace that. When I was 11, Evelyn had a baby boy, my half-brother Thomas. At first, things were fine. Evelyn was busy with the baby, and I spent more time with my grandparents. My father worked longer hours to support the bigger family. The distance grew slowly, in ways I didn't fully notice at first. Then everything fell apart when Thomas was diagnosed with leukemia at age 4. He needed intensive treatment, and my father and Evelyn basically lived at the hospital. I was 15 by then, old enough to stay home alone, but too young to fully take care of myself. I spent weekdays at our house and weekends with my grandparents. During a 3-month stretch when Thomas was receiving his most intensive treatments, my father came home only to shower, change clothes, and sleep for a few hours. He'd arrive after I was asleep and leave before I woke up. I knew this because I'd find evidence: a coffee mug in the sink, wet towels in the bathroom, his pillow indented. One morning, I got up early enough to catch him before he left. I asked if we could talk for a few minutes. He looked at his watch and said he needed to get back to the hospital. When I asked if we could talk later that night, he said he'd try but wasn't sure when he'd be home. He never mentioned our conversation again. My notebook entry that day: tried to talk to Dad today. He had no time. Thomas needs him more. Thomas might die. I'm being selfish for wanting attention. This became the family mantra: Thomas needed the focus because he might die, so I needed to not be selfish since I was healthy. But not being selfish meant becoming invisible. On my 16th birthday, my father didn't call. Evelyn texted at 9 p.m, "Sorry we missed your birthday. Things are crazy here. We'll celebrate when things calm down." They never did celebrate it. My grandparents took me out for dinner and gave me a camera they'd saved up for. I took a picture of the cake and taped it in my notebook with the text, "Sweet 16. Grandma and Grandpa remembered." By the time I turned 17, I stopped expecting anything from my father. My grandparents wanted me to live with them permanently, especially after they found me crying in their bathroom one weekend. They spoke to my father about it, but he refused, saying that would break up the family. What family? I thought. I couldn't remember the last real conversation we'd had. My senior year of high school, I accidentally cut myself while cooking dinner alone. The cut was deep enough to need stitches. I called my grandparents, who took me to the ER. They left messages for my father, but he didn't respond until the next afternoon. His text: "Just saw the messages. Everything okay now?" In my notebook, I wrote, 12 stitches. Dad found out 18 hours later. Asked if everything was okay now. What does okay even mean? That wasn't the only accident I had during those years. I never told anyone the full truth about the things I did to myself when I was alone in that house. I was afraid they'd lock me up somewhere, and then I'd truly have no one. The physical pain sometimes made the emptiness recede for a few hours. My grandparents saw the bandages and the scars. They tried to talk to me about getting help, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to be labeled as troubled on top of everything else. The school counselor once asked about some marks on my arm, and I said I scratched myself on a fence. She gave me pamphlets about dealing with stress and coping with family illness. The pamphlets recommended talking to a trusted adult. I threw them in the trash. As soon as I graduated high school, I moved out. My grandparents helped me find an apartment near the community college where I planned to take classes. I cut off all contact with my father and Evelyn immediately. No explanation, no dramatic confrontation, I just stopped responding to the occasional text messages. My grandparents respected my decision, though I know they hoped I'd eventually reconnect with him. For the first time, I started to feel slightly better. I found a job at a local bookstore, made a few friends at college, and even saw a therapist a couple of times. I didn't tell the therapist everything, but it helped to talk about some of it. Thomas died last year after his cancer returned. My grandparents attended the funeral, but I didn't. They didn't pressure me about it. My father didn't reach out directly after Thomas died, not that I expected him to. 3 weeks ago, my grandfather called to tell me my father had contacted them. Apparently, Evelyn left him shortly after Thomas died. The grief and strain was too much for their marriage. Now, a year later, my father wanted to reconnect with me. He asked my grandparents to help arrange a meeting. I thought about it for several days. Then I decided to respond, but on my terms. I spent a weekend going through all 32 of my notebooks, taking photos of specific entries. I created a detailed PowerPoint presentation with these images, organized chronologically. The first slide simply read, "Why I don't want to see you," a comprehensive explanation. I included entries about waiting for him to come home, eating dinner alone, spending holidays with grandparents because he and Evelyn were at the hospital. I included entries about my accidents, which were clearly not accidents if you read the surrounding context. I included entries where I quoted things he'd said to me during our rare interactions, things like "We'll talk later and not now, Sarah, and you need to be more understanding." The final slide had a photo of the last scrapbook page my mother made, with her note about how she and my father would always be there for me. Underneath it, I added 3 words: "She was wrong." I sent the PowerPoint to my father's email address, which my grandfather provided. I didn't include any additional message. 2 days later, my phone exploded with texts from relatives I rarely speak to, aunts, uncles, cousins on my father's side. The message was consistent. While they understood why I didn't want a relationship with my father, the PowerPoint was unnecessarily cruel. Apparently, my father had completely broken down after viewing it and was now in a terrible state. My aunt, father's sister, called and told me I'd gone too far. She said my father was already struggling with losing his son and his marriage, and now I deliberately pushed him over the edge. She said I should have just declined to meet him rather than twisting the knife. Maybe she's right. The PowerPoint was harsh, showing years of documented neglect and pain from a child's perspective. But I also feel like it was honest. My father spent years ignoring my existence, refusing to let me live with people who actually cared about me, and dismissing my attempts to communicate. Why should I soften the truth now? So, AITA for sending my father a detailed PowerPoint about how he failed me instead of just declining his attempt to reconnect? Update 1 first, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. Reading your perspectives helped me process things, especially since I've been questioning myself after the backlash from my relatives. A lot has happened in the past 3 weeks. My father's sister, Aunt Karen, has continued to contact me despite my requests for space. Last weekend, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was surprised to see her standing at my door, as we've never been close. She looked exhausted and immediately asked if she could come in. I let her in but told her I only had 30 minutes before I needed to leave for work, which was true. She sat down and didn't waste time with small talk. Karen said she'd seen my PowerPoint. Apparently, my father shared it with her after his breakdown. What surprised me was that she didn't come to criticize me further, she came to apologize. Karen admitted that no one in the family had realized how completely I'd been neglected during Thomas's illness. She thought my grandparents were essentially co-parenting me and that my father was dividing his time between Thomas and me as best he could. She had no idea that there were days, sometimes weeks, when we didn't interact at all. The part of the PowerPoint that shocked her most was the entries about my accidents. She said the family had been told I was going through a difficult adjustment and acting out occasionally, but no one realized I was hurting myself or having thoughts about ending my life. My father had apparently downplayed everything, making it sound like typical teenage rebellion rather than severe distress. Karen then revealed something I hadn't known. During Thomas's illness, my father had refused multiple offers of help from extended family. His parents, my paternal grandparents, had offered to stay at our house to help with me. 2 cousins who lived nearby had offered to take me on weekend trips to give me a break from the hospital environment. An uncle had even offered to pay for a part-time caregiver who could make sure I had proper meals and supervision. My father had rejected all these offers, telling everyone that things were under control and that I was managing fine with the current arrangement. When relatives asked about me directly, he would give vague, positive updates that had little connection to reality. I sat there processing this information, unsure how to respond. Part of me was glad to know that my father's family wasn't completely indifferent to my situation, they just hadn't known the truth. Another part of me was even more furious with my father for rejecting help that could have made a significant difference during those years. Karen then explained that she'd been thinking about this situation constantly since seeing my PowerPoint. She described growing up with my father, saying he'd always been someone who couldn't handle multiple problems at once. When faced with competing needs, he would focus entirely on what he perceived as the most urgent crisis and completely shut down awareness of everything else. It wasn't a conscious choice, she explained, but more like a psychological limitation. She wasn't offering this as an excuse, she clarified quickly, just as context. What happened to me was inexcusable regardless of the reason. But she wanted me to know that it wasn't because I wasn't loved or valued, it was because my father fundamentally couldn't manage the complexity of the situation. Before leaving, Karen gave me a small photo album. It contained pictures of me from family gatherings over the years, birthdays, holidays, summer barbecues from before Thomas got sick. In many of them, my father and I were together, smiling. There was one from a fishing trip when I was about 9, where he was teaching me to bait a hook. Another showed us building a snowman in our front yard. Karen said she wanted me to have these because they represented real moments, not fabrications. The father in those photos had loved me. She wasn't asking me to forgive him or rebuild a relationship, just to know that he hadn't always been the person who abandoned me during Thomas's illness. I thanked her for coming but didn't make any promises about contacting my father. After she left, I looked through the album once, then put it in my closet. I haven't looked at it since. 2 days after Karen's visit, I received an email from my father. The subject line was simply "I'm sorry." I stared at it in my inbox for nearly an hour before deciding not to open it. I'm not ready to read whatever he wrote. Maybe I never will be. Yesterday, my maternal grandmother called to check on me. She's always been careful not to criticize my father directly, but this time she was more open. She told me that during my mother's illness, my father had struggled similarly. He would focus entirely on work or household tasks, things he could control, rather than sitting with my mother or talking about what was happening. My mother had understood this about him and had created her scrapbook pages partly because she knew he might not be emotionally available to me after she was gone. This revelation made me look at my mother's final gift differently. Perhaps her note, "Dad and I will always be here for you," wasn't a promise about how my father would behave, but rather her hope for what he could be, or an attempt to preserve a positive image of him for me. I don't know what to do with all this new information. Understanding the context doesn't erase what happened. Knowing my father has limitations doesn't heal the wounds caused by those limitations. The years of isolation and neglect happened regardless of the explanation. For now, I'm maintaining no contact. I've asked all relatives to respect this boundary, and most have agreed. Karen checks in occasionally with brief, respectful texts that don't pressure me about my father. My maternal grandparents continue to be my primary support system, giving me space to process everything at my own pace. I'll update again if anything significant changes, but for now, I'm focusing on my own life, work, school, and building relationships with people who have proven themselves reliable. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update, and I've had some unexpected developments I wanted to share. 3 weeks ago, I finally opened my father's email. I had been avoiding it, but after a particularly rough day at work, I came home, poured a glass of wine, and decided to just get it over with. The email was long, over 2,000 words. My father started by acknowledging that nothing he could say would excuse or fully explain his actions. He didn't try to defend himself or minimize what happened. Instead, he gave a detailed account of his mental state during Thomas's illness, describing how he gradually narrowed his focus until Thomas and the hospital became his entire world. He wrote about panic attacks he'd have in the hospital parking lot that he never told anyone about. He described how he would sometimes drive to work, sit in his car for his entire shift, then drive back to the hospital, pretending he'd been at the office. He wrote about how he would stand outside my bedroom door late at night, wanting to check on me but feeling like he had nothing left to give, then leaving before I woke up. The most revealing part was when he wrote about my mother's illness. He admitted that he had emotionally shut down then too, focusing on practical matters instead of connecting with either of us. The difference was that my mother had her parents and sisters constantly present, creating a buffer that protected me from the full impact of his withdrawal. After she died and he remarried, that buffer gradually disappeared. Near the end of the email, he wrote about finding my notebooks after I moved out. He said he read some entries and finally understood the extent of what he'd done, but by then I had already cut contact. He said he respected my decision and wouldn't have reached out now except that losing Thomas and then Evelyn had forced him to reevaluate everything. He closed by saying he didn't expect forgiveness or even a response. He just wanted me to know that he had read every slide of my PowerPoint, recognized the truth in it, and would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. I didn't respond to the email, but reading it affected me more than I expected. For the first time, I saw my father as a flawed person rather than just the man who abandoned me. It didn't change what happened, but it provided context I hadn't fully considered before. Last weekend, something unexpected happened. I was helping my maternal grandparents clean out their attic when we found a box of my mother's things that hadn't been opened since her death. Inside were letters she'd written to various people during her final months. There was one addressed to me with a note saying it should be given to me when I turned 18, but it had been forgotten in the shuffle after she died. The letter was 8 pages long, written during hospital stays. My mother wrote about her hopes for my future, memories from when I was little, and advice she wished she could give me as I grew up. Toward the end, she wrote about my father. She described him as someone who loved deeply but retreated into himself when faced with overwhelming emotion. She wrote that this wasn't an excuse for any failure on his part, but rather a reality she wanted me to understand. There was one paragraph that particularly stood out. My mother wrote, "If your father ever disappoints you, please remember that it's not because you aren't lovable or important. It's because some people, even good people, can break under certain pressures. I hope he will be everything you need, but if he isn't, know that it reflects his limitations, not your worth." Reading those words, written 15 years ago by someone who knew both of us so well, has given me a lot to think about. My mother somehow anticipated exactly what would happen and tried to prepare me for it, even from beyond the grave. A week after finding the letter, I met with a therapist who specializes in childhood trauma. I've had 3 sessions so far. In our last session, the therapist suggested that maintaining absolute no contact with my father might actually be keeping me tied to the past in some ways. She didn't suggest reconciliation, just that completely shutting him out requires energy that might be better used elsewhere. I'm still processing this idea. I don't know if I want my father in my life in any capacity. The thought of seeing him face to face still makes my stomach clench. But I'm starting to wonder if there might be some middle ground between full reconciliation and complete estrangement. For now, I've decided to send a brief email acknowledging that I read his message. I didn't offer forgiveness or suggest meeting, just confirmed that I'd read what he wrote and was processing it. He responded with a single sentence, "Thank you for letting me know." That's where things stand currently. I'm not rushing any decisions. My therapist says healing isn't linear, and there's no right way to handle this situation. All I know is that I feel less angry than I did 3 months ago when I sent that PowerPoint, but I still don't know what, if anything, comes next. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I think this will be my final post about this situation. A lot has changed, though not in the way many might expect. About 4 months ago, I agreed to meet my father at a coffee shop near my apartment. We set a time limit of 1 hour, and my closest friend waited nearby in case I needed to leave abruptly. Seeing my father in person was jarring. He'd aged significantly since I last saw him 5 years ago. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd lost weight. He looked tired in a permanent way, like someone who had been running on empty for years. We sat across from each other, both holding our coffee cups like shields. The conversation was awkward at first, small talk about the weather, my job, his new apartment. Eventually, we moved to more significant topics. My father reiterated much of what he'd written in his email. He acknowledged his complete failure as a parent during Thomas's illness. He didn't offer excuses, just context. He mentioned that he'd been seeing a therapist regularly since Thomas died and had only recently begun to understand the patterns in his behavior. I didn't say much. I mostly listened and observed. What struck me most was that even as he was trying to connect, I could see him struggling. His eyes would dart away when emotions ran high. He would shift topics abruptly when we approached anything too painful. Even in this controlled environment, with everything at stake, he couldn't fully overcome his tendency to withdraw from difficult feelings. Near the end of our meeting, I asked the question that had been bothering me for months: why didn't you accept help from your family when they offered to support me during Thomas's illness? He looked down at his hands for a long time before answering. Then he explained that accepting help would have meant acknowledging that he was failing as a father, something he couldn't face at the time. Each offer of assistance felt like an accusation, highlighting his inadequacy. So he pretended everything was fine, convinced himself that I was more resilient than I actually was, and rejected the very support that could have made a difference. As he spoke, I realized something important: my father hadn't changed fundamentally. He had more awareness now, more regret, more understanding of his actions. But the core issue, his inability to face painful emotions directly, remained largely intact. Given another crisis, he would likely retreat again, though perhaps not as completely. We parted with no dramatic resolution. No tearful reconciliation, no angry final words. Just two people who shared DNA but little else, acknowledging a painful history without finding a clear path forward. In the months since that meeting, we've had limited contact. He sends an occasional text message, usually just checking in. I respond briefly, giving basic updates but nothing deeply personal. We haven't met in person again. What has changed is my perspective. I no longer view my father through the lens of absolute abandonment or total failure. I see him as someone with significant limitations who faced circumstances that overwhelmed his capacity. This doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps me contextualize it. I've continued therapy, focusing less on my father and more on the patterns his absence created in my life, particularly my tendency to expect disappointment from people and keep relationships at a safe distance. I've been working on letting people get closer, which is harder than I expected. I've also reconnected with some extended family members, including my paternal grandparents. They've been respectful of my boundaries and haven't pushed for more contact with my father than I'm comfortable with. The most significant change has been my relationship with my notebooks. After 15 years of daily documenting, I've stopped the practice. The last entry I made was after meeting my father at the coffee shop. I wrote, "Saw Dad today. He's just a person. Not a monster, not a hero. Just a flawed person who broke under pressure. Like a lot of people, probably." Instead of continuing the notebooks, I've started taking photography classes, inspired by the camera my grandparents gave me years ago. I find that capturing moments visually gives me a different perspective than writing about them, more immediate, less analytical. My father and I will likely never have a close relationship. Too much was broken for too long. But we've reached a kind of détente, a recognition of each other's existence without expectations or demands. It's not forgiveness exactly, more like acceptance of what is and what isn't possible. For those who have followed my story from the beginning, thank you for your support and perspectives. They've been valuable as I've navigated this complex situation. I hope my experience might help others dealing with similar family trauma, not as a roadmap but as a reminder that healing takes many forms and follows no prescribed timeline.